Thank you for the mercifully short introduction. Hard to live up to some of them. And thank you for the privilege of being the setup for Scott Hahn next month. I feel like John the Baptist introducing Jesus. In the millennial year 2000, Waterstone's book company in England decided to poll its readers as to the greatest book of the 20th century. They were amazed and surprised when The Lord of the Rings won by a large margin. The critics sniffed and said there must be some mistake. Let's expand the poll beyond England to all English language readership. The second poll produced an even larger margin of victory. Then they decided, well, let's go the .com route and let's poll people electronically. Same champion. A fourth poll around the world. Lord of the Rings has been translated into I don't know how many languages. Even in translation, it came out number one. Some of the critics sniffed and vomited and had diarrhea. One of them actually wrote these words: "Why have we taught these people to read? What has become of our sacred task of education if what they're going to read is juvenile trash?" Well, that says nothing whatsoever about The Lord of the Rings, but it says a lot about the critics. That the critics are a most arrogant, out-of-touch oligarchy of snobs. Everybody loves The Lord of the Rings. A 12-year-old girl read The Lord of the Rings and cried for 24 hours. Her mother thought there was something seriously wrong. When she stopped crying, she finally said to her mother, "No, Mother, it's not because I'm sad that I cry. It's that I'm glad. I've never read anything so beautiful in my life." I remember the first 2 times I tried to read The Lord of the Rings. I had been recommended it by some friends, and I got about 20 or 30 or maybe 40 pages into it, and I said, well, this is nice, this is well written, but I'm not that interested in hobbits, so I put the thing aside. I'm an idiot. The next time, a few years later, I still remember, 3 meals and 1 night's sleep. I had to finish all 3 volumes. It's a delightful obsession. The only reason we have this book, the only reason it exists, is 2 events happened to make it exist. One, there was a student whose name I think nobody knows, who wrote a very dull term paper with a blank page in it. And Tolkien was grading the term paper, and he was forcing himself to read it, and he was rather bored. He came to the blank page, and he said his hand, almost by itself, scribbled on the page the words, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit." He looked at the words and said, "What's a hobbit? There's only one way to find out. I'll have to write a story about one." So he did. Thus, The Hobbit was born. The publisher liked it so much that he said, let's do a longer Hobbit. And Tolkien said, well, I have this myth, this legendarium, which I've been working on all my life. Would you like to publish it? And he gave him so many volumes, including what we now have as the Silmarillion. And the publisher said, no, it's too much. So Tolkien gave up. So the second person we have to thank for the existence of The Lord of the Rings is C.S. Lewis, who badgered Tolkien, as Tolkien badgered Lewis. By the way, Tolkien frequently badgered Lewis about why he didn't swim the Tiber and become a Roman Catholic. And Lewis once said to him, according to Joseph Pearce and also Christopher Derrick, both of whom wrote books on this subject, if you want to be my friend, and I certainly want to be yours, I'll talk about anything else, but I don't want to talk about that. You couldn't possibly understand. You were not born in Belfast. Lewis was aware of his prejudices, I suppose. But Lewis also badgered Tolkien in a much more successful way. Get that book published. It's a masterpiece. It was turned down 11 times in various forms by various publishers. 11 times before it was finally accepted for publication. So if it hadn't been for C.S. Lewis, we wouldn't have The Lord of the Rings. I've been asked to talk about Catholic themes in The Lord of the Rings. And in one sense, the whole of the Lord of the Rings is full of Catholicism, because Christ, the Christ that the church proclaims, is at the very center of this work. Lewis wrote much more explicit and semi-allegorical Christ fiction. At least Tolkien thought the Narnia Chronicles were allegorical. But when people hear that about the Lord of the Rings, they say, wait a minute, there's no religion in the Lord of the Rings. God is not mentioned. It takes place long before the incarnation, so Christ is not mentioned. Well, how is it religious? Tolkien answered that question in one of his letters. He said, the Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally Christian and Catholic work. How? One of the scenes in it tells you how. When the Fellowship enters the elf forest of Lothlorien, I think it's Sam who says, there's a funny light in this place. Everything seems lit by it, but you don't see its source. You don't see where the light's coming from. Light from an invisible lamp. That's the Lord of the Rings. The lamp, of course, is Christ, the Logos, who enlightens every man and elf and hobbit and wizard who comes into the world. But he doesn't himself become visible until later. You can write religious fiction, even good religious fiction, about religious themes, although it's difficult. I think it's extremely difficult to write religious fiction about Jesus. Protestant evangelicals try it, Tim LaHaye and Frank Peretti and people like that. I think those books are embarrassingly bad. I want to sink into, I don't know, a virus or something when I read them. They're incredibly bad. Now I ask myself the question, why is it that you can write good historical fiction about any other character? Julius Caesar, Henry VIII, Harry Truman, Mao Zedong, anybody, good or bad. You cannot write good fiction about Jesus. Lewis is the only one who did. The Chronicles of Narnia. He got a lot of letters from children that said, I feel guilty because I love Aslan more than I love Jesus. And Lewis had to say, Aslan is Jesus. But it's not an allegory. An allegory has only one right interpretation, and it's a kind of a code, and once you read the code, you've got the point. But Jesus is a man. Aslan is a lion. Jesus came to earth. Aslan came to Narnia. So that's not an allegory, it's a supposition. If there were another world like Narnia with talking animals, and it fell, what would Christ do? Maybe he'd come as a lion and do something similar but not identical. So it's not an allegory. Tolkien misunderstood it. He thought it was. But Tolkien explicitly says he deliberately keeps all religious themes underground in The Lord of the Rings so that it can permeate the whole of the book instead of being at one point. That's because Jesus lived not on Tolkien's front porch or in Tolkien's front yard, but in his house and in his kitchen and in his bedroom and in his mind. He was inside and therefore illumined everything. Now, that's a big claim. I can prove it by reading quotations from Tolkien's letters, which, by the way, are wonderful. Most authors' letters aren't that good. Even C.S. Lewis's letters are mostly pretty boring. Some of them are quite brilliant, but there's 3 volumes of them, and most of them are barely worth reading. But Tolkien's, like Flannery O'Connor's, are wonderful. I highly recommend the letters of Tolkien. One of them explains that strategy very clearly. Deliberately keeps it out of the part so that it can be in the whole. Well, if it's in the whole, then it must manifest itself in many different ways. How? Well, let's see. I've got 6 at least, each of which is divided into many parts. I want to first talk about Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings, and then talk about Marian figures, and then Eucharistic themes, and then some theological themes, and then some ethical themes. Themes. What are themes? Well, a theme is one of the 5 dimensions of all narrative. Narrative or story is our oldest art and our most universal art. Every culture that's human has stories and tells stories. If it doesn't tell stories, it's not human. If it does, it does. And every story has 5 dimensions. There's the plot, there's the characters, there's the setting, there's the theme, what's it about, and there's the style. All right? Themes are not necessarily moral lessons or religious allegories, but it's the answer to the question, what's the story about? Well, ultimately, our story is his story, thus history. God likes to make puns. And it's about him. And how do we know him? We know him via Christ, the only way to the Father, both pre-incarnate and incarnate, which means that since, as St. Pope John Paul II loved to quote from the documents of Vatican II, since Christ shows us not only who God is, but also who we are, since Christ is perfect man as well as perfect God, it follows that there are Christ figures, even in atheist writings, because everybody who writes about human beings wants to show what a human being looks like. But a Christ figure specifically has 2 things that ordinary human beings don't have. One of them is that he's a savior. He saves the whole world. Nobody else can do that. Secondly is that he dies and rises again. Now, there are a lot of mythic stories about saviors and even more about dying and rising gods, but they're all myths. This is, as Lewis says, the myth become fact. Are there Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings? Yeah, 3 of them. The 3 main characters in The Lord of the Rings all help to save all of Middle-earth, and they all die and rise or resurrect in different ways. They are, of course, Gandalf, Aragorn, and Frodo. Gandalf literally dies, sinking into the mines of Moria with a Balrog, and then returns as no longer Gandalf the Grey, but Gandalf the White. Aragorn takes the paths of the dead, and he's told no one can take these paths and live, but he does. He has power over the dead. Frodo dies in a different way. He dies to the Shire and to his home in Middle-earth. He cannot survive. The wound that he received from the Morgul blade at Weathertop cannot be cured. So at the end, all his friends, most especially Sam, are saddened to see that he must take the ship to the Grey Havens. And he also dies to everything that he loves in undertaking this quest, the comforts of the Shire, hobbit life. These 3 characters, Gandalf, Aragorn, and Frodo, are respectively a prophet, a king, and a priest. Gandalf is a wizard, who's a kind of a prophet. He gives superhuman wisdom. Aragorn is literally a king, and Frodo is a priest in a rather more mysterious way, but he does to that ring sort of the reverse thing that the priest does to a Eucharist. And we find in most of our great literature, most great novels, we find 3 protagonists, and no matter who the author is, almost always there's a prophet figure, a priest figure, and a king figure. For instance, let's take the world's most philosophical TV show, Star Trek. Spock is obviously the prophet. He's the intellectual. Captain Kirk is the king, the captain of the ship, and Bones McCoy is the compassionate doctor, sort of the priest, the healer. Let's take the classic movie Jaws, 3 protagonists. You have Hooper, the scientist from Woods Hole. You have Quint, the captain of the Orca, and you have Brody, the landlubber, who just sort of does his best. Let's take the greatest novel in the history of the world, I classify The Lord of the Rings as an epic more than a novel. It's certainly The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. There are three brothers. Ivan is the philosopher, the prophet figure, the intellectual, and Alyosha is the priest figure, and Dmitri is like a king. He's an egotist. He's a would-be controller. Even in the Gospels, you have these three people. Jesus picks 3 of his 12 as his inner circle, and they alone accompany him up the Mount of Transfiguration and into the Garden of Gethsemane. Peter, James, and John. John, we can see in his gospel, is a brilliant theologian and mystic. He's the prophet figure, the intellectual. Peter is the ruler, the head of the apostolic college, and James is the practical moralist. You find this everywhere. Why? Because the human soul has 3 powers that constitute parts of the image of God. 3 powers that no animal has. The power of the mind to know truth, the power of the will to freely choose the good, and the power of the heart to love what is beautiful. Intellect, will, and heart, 3 distinctively human things. And when God established his kingdom in Israel, he divinely ordained these 3 functions, prophet, priest, and king, to fulfill these 3 powers of humanity. In fact, every religion in the world has these 3 dimensions. They're often called creed, code, and cult, or words, works, and worship, or theology, morality, and liturgy. But in The Lord of the Rings, these Christ figures are not just a prophet, a priest, and a king, but they save the whole world, and they do so by dying and rising again. And it's natural. You probably didn't even think about that or notice that when you read The Lord of the Rings. It's not that Tolkien's deliberately hiding it. It's just there in the nature of things. You don't notice the fact that everybody here has a round ball perched between their shoulders, do you? That's kind of weird, isn't it? But there it is. It's natural. There are Marian themes in The Lord of the Rings, too. Keep in mind that by a theme, I don't mean an allegory. Elbereth. Who is Elbereth? Her name is repeated with great reverence many times, especially by the elves. She's associated with something in the heavens, a star, perhaps an elf assumed into heaven. She's associated with light. The invocation of her name saves Sam and Frodo from Shelob's lair. And that beautiful scene that Tolkien himself confesses wrings tears from his eyes even when he rereads his own work is that scene where Frodo and Sam are taking the ring across Mordor, dressed in orc rags, and they're in this slag heap, this horrible, ugly, dirty, dark, joyless world. Sam is keeping watch while Frodo's asleep, and the clouds are parting a little bit, symbol of what's going to happen pretty soon. And he sees a single star shining. And Tolkien says, the shaft of light smote his heart. And he knew that it could not be touched by anything Sauron could do on Earth. And that gave him hope again. Now, that's, you may say, a bit of a stretch to connect that with the Mother of God, but Tolkien has many such clues throughout the book. But I suppose the most obviously Marian theme is more ethical than cosmological. He certainly has in mind the single most important word any merely human being ever uttered in the entire history of the world. When God sent his angel to a teenage Jewish girl and asked humble permission for her to be the mother of God, and she said yes, fiat. Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, be it done unto me according to your word. and thus she opened the doors to our salvation. Frodo did something strikingly similar at the Council of Elrond, where all the great powers and intellects of the good guys are met together to try to figure out what they can do to this ring, this horrible ring of power that's intrinsically evil and can neither be hidden nor used, but only abused. And they decide the only thing to do is to destroy it, and the only way to destroy it is to bring it back to its source, Mount Doom, and somebody has to do the job. Who will do it? Well, fate, or divine providence, has put the ring into Frodo's possession, so he has the right. And he alone has the right to utter the Marian words, "I will take the ring, though I do not know the way." That saved Middle-earth. Finally, you also have Mary's philosophy of history in The Lord of the Rings, the quintessentially Christian philosophy of history, which is articulated in her Magnificat. How does God run history? By putting down the proud and exalting the humble, by making the first last and the last first, by ensuring that those who die to themselves will live and those who live for themselves will die. And it takes the humble hobbit, Frodo, and perhaps even more than that, Sam, humblest man in Middle-earth, to save the world. We also have some Eucharistic themes. The most obvious one is the waybread of the elves, lembas, which once again is not an allegory. Remember, a theme is kind of a reverberation of a sound, a musical sound. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. It's just inspired by it, breathed by it, so to speak. Lembas is not the Eucharist, but it has some of the powers of the Eucharist. The more you rely on it, the stronger you are. And it gives you a kind of a supernatural strength that nothing else can. There is also the Eucharistic theme of a kind of sacramental view of nature in which matter is never mere matter, but always has some spiritual properties. You might even call this a kind of magic. It's not magic because magic is impersonal and authoritative, whereas sacraments are personal and they work through faith. But nevertheless, the difference between a sacrament and magic, Tolkien says, is, in one of his letters, the fundamental theme of The Lord of the Rings, the contrast between two kinds of magic, the magic of the elves and the magic of Sauron. It's in my book, and I see you have a copy of it, and I forgot mine. I'm going to borrow yours and see if I can find it. If I can't find it in 5 seconds, I'm going to give up. Here it is. I cheated. I knew the page. In his essay on fairy stories, which is the definitive thing ever written in the entire history of the world about the subject of fantasy, fairy stories, or myth, Tolkien defines faerie as a kind of magic. He says, faerie itself may perhaps most nearly be translated by magic, but it is magic of a peculiar mood and power at the furthest pole from the vulgar devices of the laborious scientific magician. What does that mean? Well, he says, the magic of Sauron is a magic of external plans or devices, apparatus, instead of the development of the inherent inner powers or talents. It is bulldozing the real world or coercing other wills. The machine is our more obvious modern form of it. The Lord of the Rings is not an attack on technology. There's a lot of good technology in The Lord of the Rings, swords, cities, etc. But technologism, yeah, all power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the ring is a kind of absolute or unlimited power. I have not used the word magic consistently, and indeed the elf queen Galadriel is obliged to remonstrate with the hobbits on their confused use of the word, both for the devices and operations of the enemy and for those of the elves. The elves are there in my tales to demonstrate the difference. Their magic is art, and its object is not power, but subcreation, not domination and tyrannical reforming of the creation. That's enough. But, of course, the question of technology is simply a bit of escapist fantasy and has no relevance to our world. Another Eucharistic theme in The Lord of the Rings is the relation between matter and spirit. There are countless examples, most of them you don't even notice because they're so natural. They fit the expectations of your heart, even though not of your mind, of matter being more than just passive, brute, dumb, meaningless stuff or energy. Ever since René Descartes gave us his two clear and distinct ideas of thought that has no size or weight in space, and matter that cannot think at all, we have had a great problem overcoming that kind of dualism. And we have even a great problem in dealing with plants and animals, which are neither rational spirit nor mere matter. And there are many degrees of them in the great chain of being. Tolkien goes back to that primitive or commonsensical cosmology of a kind of sacramental or semi-Eucharistic universe in which, in various forms, matter gives rise to different levels of something a little more than matter. There's no sharp distinction between matter and spirit. The world is not just a thing out there, and we are also a part of the world, not just a thing in here. There are so many examples of it that I could take all night in quoting them. Finally, another Eucharistic theme is the fellowship. The first volume is called The Fellowship of the Rings. Another word for fellowship is church. Those who are called out, ecclesia. Those who are called to form a community for a sacred task. The church is sort of the larger Eucharist. The church is the fundamental sacrament. It's the body of Christ. Dostoevsky, though a very different kind of novelist and with a very different kind of sensibility than Tolkien, although he shares the same Christian faith, has a word for this which pervades all of his novels. It's a Russian word. It doesn't have any exact English translation. The word is sobornost, sometimes translated fellowship or community or oneness or togetherness. It's a kind of mystical co-inherence and mutual dependence of us on each other. No one person can do the job, only the team. And the team is not like the gears and levers of a machine or the individual votes in an election. It's an organism. All right, let's look at some theological themes which are more easily put into words, more easily definable. One of them, perhaps the most obvious of all, is divine providence. The plot moves by that mechanism. At the very beginning, when Frodo inherits the ring from Bilbo, after Bilbo gives it to Gandalf, disappearing in his 111th birthday party, and Frodo has it, and he doesn't know what it is. Gandalf suspects, although he too doesn't know. Frodo asks Gandalf, why did this blasted ring come my way? It's caused Bilbo so much trouble, almost cost him his life with Gollum. And Gandalf says, there's more than one power at work, Frodo. It's, of course, Sauron's ring, and therefore the ring itself has a kind of power in it from Sauron. Sauron has externalized his power in making that ring, which, by the way, is another related and important theme. We are like that. We are Sauron. We have become immensely strong through our ring, which is technology. Technology conquers nature much more efficiently and effectively and powerfully than anything. But why do we feel weaker, not stronger, personally, than our pre-technological ancestors? If we had a nuclear war, which of us would survive a nuclear winter? Not many. The Boy Scouts and farmers and peasants, maybe, that's all. Why? Because we're like Robert Downey Jr. in Iron Man. We've got a great big spacesuit, but inside we're just a little shivering nobody. We've put our power into externality. That's what Sauron's done. That ring is Sauron. You capture the ring, you capture Sauron. You destroy our technology, you destroy us. And we're increasingly addicted to it. We're disappearing into our smartphones. Take a teenager from a smartphone and they'd rather have you take their soul, because their soul is there. Well, the ring is Sauron, then. It's his power. That's one power. There are other powers. There's Gollum, his will to get the ring. It's his precious. And whoever inherits the ring from Gollum, whether it's Bilbo or Frodo, is tempted by that. So we have a conflict of three wills here. One of them evil, Sauron's. Two of them mixed between good and evil. And then Gandalf says, beyond that, there was another power at work. He doesn't label it. It's obviously divine providence. God's allowing all this evil, pure and mixed, to happen for a reason. He's writing a story. And the point of the story comes at the end, just as the point of an argument comes at the end. Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? Or is it even worse than a tragedy? Is it just a nihilistic, meaningless blob? It's a comedy. It's a divine comedy. And the author is working out all things for the greater good, even evil, even the greatest evil. That's what he did in our world. What's the greatest evil that ever happened? Well, moral evil is far worse than physical evil. And when Christ died, that was not only the greatest physical evil, because crucifixion was the most excruciating torture ever devised, but it was also the greatest moral evil because it was the deliberate torture and murder of Almighty God, the worst deed ever committed. And we Christians celebrate that evil on a holiday that we call Good Friday. What massive paradox. Somehow God brings evil out of good. That's what he's doing in The Lord of the Rings. There's a design. There's a hidden plot to the story. Another theological theme is a kind of traditionalism. All religions perpetrate themselves not by biological procreation, but by tradition, by handing on the baton of wisdom. Tradition simply means handing over. And The Lord of the Rings is a very traditional, or if you will, conservative book. Old things are generally better than new things. History goes downward more quickly than it goes upward. It's not inevitable that it goes down any more than it's inevitable that it goes up, but the ancestors are to be respected. They're somehow greater, as an oak is greater than an acorn. And they have authority. Those are very unfashionable themes today. I think simply as an amateur psychologist, not in terms of political allegiances at all, I think that inevitably conservatives are happy and progressives are unhappy. Because by definition, a conservative wants to conserve what they have. Why? Because they hate it? No, because they love it. And when you love something, you're happy with it. And a progressive wants to progress on and leave the old stuff behind because he doesn't like it anymore. So he's unhappy with it. So by definition, traditionalists or conservatives are happy people. That doesn't mean that everybody who claims the label deserves it. Another theological theme is divine grace using human weakness. There's nobody that doesn't have weakness. There's nobody that doesn't have vices, including Frodo, including Sam, including Gandalf. There's nobody who can't be corrupted by that ring. And everybody who uses it is, in some way or other, corrupted by it, more or less. The only question is it more or is it less? It's not to be or not to be. It's to be more or to be less. All right. Even Frodo is corrupted by it. And at the cracks of doom, he gives in. He rats. I came to destroy this ring, I now claim it for my own. When you came to that scene, when you first read The Lord of the Rings, if you didn't know that that was going to happen, I guarantee a sword went through your heart. Oh no, my hero, Frodo, the innocent one. Evil is stronger than good. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Tolkien says so. Let's be honest enough, realistic. The bull is stronger than the china shop. The nuclear bomb is stronger than the city of Hiroshima. Yeah, evil is strong. Tolkien says in one of his letters, he loves to read the old myths where there's a hero. But the problem is, most of the myths are written by pagans, not Christians, and the hero usually wins. And then he has reason to be proud of himself and self-satisfied. But in Christianity, pride is not a virtue, as it was for Aristotle. It's a vice. Indeed, it's the most demonic vice of all, the motivation for Satan's fall. So if Frodo had been good enough and strong enough to resist the temptation, he would be a pagan hero. And since we all identify with heroes, I hope we don't identify with villains, we would identify with Frodo and his pride and self-satisfaction, and thus be corrupted by our very moral success. Which is why Pascal, one of my favorite philosophers, reversed the judgment of many of the church fathers that Stoicism is a far more unchristian philosophy than Epicureanism. Epicureanism is a materialistic, egotistic, hedonistic, selfish, animalistic philosophy. It's a philosophy for slobs. And Stoicism is a philosophy for snobs. Practice moral virtue. Climb the moral mountain. Breathe the air. You can do it. It's even worse. So, when Tolkien set out to write his story about a hero, he has a dilemma. Does the hero succeed? If so, pride. Does he fail? If so, evil wins out over good. So what's his solution? Who is the ultimate savior of Middle-earth? Who is the last link in the chain that allows the quest to happen? Judas Iscariot, Gollum. If Judas hadn't betrayed Christ, we wouldn't be saved. God uses even the villain, and uses even Frodo's villainy at the end. Wow. So the real hero of The Lord of the Rings is not Frodo, it's God. Tolkien says that in a letter. In fact, he says, the main character in The Lord of the Rings is God. even though his name is not mentioned. Why is that so? Very obvious. Why is the ring evil? Why is Sauron's ring evil? Because Sauron is playing God. Well, why is it wrong to play God? It isn't if you're God. But it is if you're not. And Sauron's isn't God. So, because Sauron isn't God, Sauron, who plays God, is evil, and his ring is evil. Oh, so God's the main character. Wow. He likes to be anonymous, you know. If we could strip off all appearances and see all things exactly as they are, we would all die instantly. Why? Because God says, no man can see my face and live. God hides for our own good. Just imagine, thought experiment. One of the reasons I love the Eucharist is that I get no profound religious experiences out of it. No mystical highs, no deep tears. It's like bread. That's good. Suppose every time you receive the Eucharist, God zapped you with a mystical experience. You'd get a spiritual sweet tooth. You'd want the experience. You'd want it for you, not for him. So he lets you be a little bit like Christ on the cross, who had no sensible consolations. He even lost the sense of his Father's presence. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And yet he kept on. Now, we can't do that much, but we can do something like it. This is why he hides. Even in the Eucharist, remember Thomas Aquinas' wonderful Eucharistic hymn, Adoro te devote, latens deitas, latens meaning hiding. What's God doing in the Eucharist? He's doing something. He's very active. He's hiding. He's like a little kid playing hide and seek. What are you doing there behind the door? I'm not doing nothing. I'm hiding. He's hiding for our own good. Another theological theme in The Lord of the Rings associated with sacramentalism is supernaturalism. Nature is itself a kind of a miracle, a kind of divine activity. Unless you're a deist, God didn't simply create the world and forget about it. He continues to act in it. In fact, behind what we can see, there's all sorts of more levels of nature, even on the physical level. Any scientist will tell you that. The Christian philosophy of nature is basically Hamlet's in the great play, where Horatio, who didn't believe in ghosts, sees a ghost, Hamlet's father, doesn't know what to think, and Hamlet says, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, that are dreamed in your philosophies. Well, there's either more or less or the same. If there are fewer things in heaven and earth than in our philosophies, then reality is a cheat. And most of the great ideas that we have are just subjective. If there's more out there than there is in here, then we're like a little kid in a great big mansion, something new to explore every day. And if it's exactly the same, then we know it all and we're bored. So the only happy philosophy is Shakespeare's or Horatio's, which is also Tolkien's. There's always more. There's a kind of Platonic, if you know anything about Plato and if you've read The Republic and you remember that allegory of the cave, there's larger and larger worlds as you move from the shadows to the things, to the fire, to the light inside the cave, to the world outside the cave. There's always more. And nothing is merely itself. Even Karat Haras is not merely a mountain. It's cruel. And that's not just a metaphor. Finally, what, according to Christian theology, is man? There are 4 philosophies of man. One is that man is good. That's optimism. That's Rousseau. That denies the existence of evil. The other is that man is evil. That's Machiavelli and Hobbes. That denies human goodness. A third is that man is neither good nor evil, because good and evil are just imaginary. That's nihilism. No, man is both very good and very evil. And we're surprised to see great evil appear in good people, like Boromir. And we're surprised to see evil arise in good people, like Frodo. Finally, my last category is ethical or moral values in The Lord of the Rings. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, which is my candidate for one of the two most essential books of modern times, if you want to understand the culture that you live in, read The Abolition of Man and Brave New World. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis says that all cultures, all societies before our own, all our ancestors, believed that the ultimate meaning of life was something objective, a real moral law, to conform yourself to what he calls the Tao, the way, the right way of living. And the means are wisdom and virtue and self-discipline. For us, the summum bonum, the greatest good, the meaning of life, the most important thing is exactly the opposite, to impose our will upon objective reality. And our means is a technique. The denial of what the Stoics and Thomas Aquinas call the natural law, that is, an objective, universal set of moral absolutes, the denial of that has never taken root in society at large, only in small segments like the ancient sophists. Today, it's the prevailing philosophy in our whole society, everywhere in Western civilization, especially in academia. Well, that philosophy is brilliantly refuted throughout The Lord of the Rings. Not only do the bad guys that get their comeuppance and there's cosmic justice, but it's explicitly articulated at one point when the writers of Rohan meet, let's see, it's Aragorn and Gimli and Orlando Bloom. And they say, what? Hobbits and elves and dwarfs? Legends come to life. How can one know what to do in such times? And Aragorn replies, as one always has. Good and evil are not one thing among hobbits and another among men and another among elves. Neither has it changed. Ooh. If we don't go back to the Tao, to the natural moral law, if we continue in our mudslide, what lies ahead? That's why I want you to read Brave New World. We're 2/3 of the way there. No society in the history of the world has ever survived without believing in and practicing the Tao, the natural law. Never has happened. So either we will refute history's most reliable principle, or we will not survive, or we will repent. Those are the only three possibilities. An ethical value that we usually forget or underestimate is very prominent in The Lord of the Rings. In fact, it's primary. You might say it's the most primary or primitive value of all, at least in social ethics, because a society holds together only if people trust each other. And you don't trust people who are liars and who don't keep their promises. So promise keeping is, in almost all primitive societies, the first and most necessary value. And Tolkien himself makes an editorial intrusion in his own plot very early in the book, where he's retelling the story of Gollum and Bilbo and the transfer of the ring. And he notes that Bilbo suspected that Gollum might be so evil that he might not keep his most solemn promises. He had never met such a person. Such a person would be hardly human, but there was rumors that there were such people around. Maybe Gollum might be one. How surprising. Wow. Well, that's rather extreme. I mean, Politicians keep their promises, right? And lawyers, used car salesmen, of course. A third very obvious ethical theme is the relation between pride and humility. It's the hobbits who alone can defeat Sauron. And their power is their very humility. That's another Marian theme, of course. I am the handmaid of the Lord, and because of that, all generations shall call me blessed. Another ethical theme, the value of detachment. All the mystics are strong on that. Why? Do they say that the pleasures and powers and stuff in this world are evil? No, of course not. God created them and designed them. Why then do we have to be detached from them? Precisely because they're so good and beautiful. We become addicted. All sin is a kind of addiction. As I'll try to show tomorrow in my talk about freedom, the opposite of freedom is addiction. An addict is by definition not free. There's nothing more addictive than the ring. It's a magnet, and it reduces you to an iron filing. What do you do when you see a magnet if you are an iron filing? Run. One of my favorite presidential quotations is Harry Truman's. I think they asked him this after he left the presidency. You were raised as a simple haberdasher, and you found yourself in the Oval Office. What kind of a country are we in? And he said, in this great land of ours, every little baby that's born an American citizen has an equal chance of someday finding himself in the Oval Office. That's just the chance the poor little bastard has to take. As a wise man. We haven't had a wiser quotation from any president since then. Another issue in ethics that is pretty clear in The Lord of the Rings is the social ethic that is neither collectivist nor individualist. It's neither socialist or communist on the one hand, nor is it the cultivation of autonomy on the other hand. Tolkien described his social and political philosophy in one of his letters as anarchic monarchism. Well, that's sort of British, isn't it? They muddle along, and they have the pleasure of seeing kings and queens, but also the confusion and the responsibility of doing things themselves. The chapter towards the end of The Lord of the Rings, namely the Scouring of the Shire, is by far the most politically explicit of all. It's an attack on state socialism, which was imposed upon the happy Shire by Saruman. And the hobbits have to take it back, and they fight another little war in their own backyard, because that's where all wars both begin and end. Peter Jackson, though a technological genius and a maker of a truly great movie, missed that point entirely. He simply omitted that. Now, you can omit a lot of things. You have to omit Tom Bombadil. He's not essential to the plot. He's fun, but you can't do everything unless you have an extra hour. But you can't omit that. That's essential to the plot. In the movie, the hobbits just go back to where they were. Apparently, you can go home again. And there's no price. And the Shire is still untouched by the war. No, won't work that way. Why, then, did he omit that? Well, obviously, because that's an attack on his religion. What's his religion? Well, he's in Hollywood. The religion of Hollywood is state socialism. And that's an attack on state socialism. So that's blasphemy, so you have to leave that out. I'm joking, half joking. Finally, the last ethical value is the power of love, not just friendship, that too, fellowship, but also passion and pity. It's the pity of Bilbo that Gandalf correctly prophesies will save Middle-earth. Bilbo could have killed Gollum, had the right to, didn't. Also at different times, Aragorn and Frodo could have killed Gollum and had the right to, but didn't. They let him live. And because Gollum lived, the quest was completed. Evil was allowed to defeat itself. That's what evil is. All evil is a kind of suicide. The two most different, most opposite